Thomas spent the next few hours revisiting old documents. The original Maplewood Charter was still crisp, annotated in his precise handwriting. It had been designed with balance in mind to protect the character of the neighborhood while guarding against overreach. But somewhere along the line, it had been warped into something else entirely. He found the clause they referenced about fencing. Section 8, paragraph B. But in the original, there was no restriction against decorative lattice or cedar panels, only a note about safety near sidewalks. His fence had been approved 20 years ago and hadn't changed. The accusation was a fabrication. The phone rang once, a short buzz from an unknown number, then stopped. Thomas didn't call back. Instead, he pulled open the blinds and looked out into the night. Across the street, porch lights flickered off. He saw a silhouette pause near the corner of his property. The shape bent down, lingered, then moved away quickly into the dark. He stepped out onto the porch, calm and wordless, and checked the bushes near the fence. Nothing but fresh footprints in the grass. The next morning, he drove to the county clerk's office, a building most homeowners had never stepped foot in. He didn't need an appointment. The clerk recognized him instantly. "Mr. Kane," she said, glancing over her glasses. "Haven't seen you in a while." "I'm looking for revision filings on the Maplewood Estates HOA, he said. "Governance amendments? Past 5 years. She nodded, disappeared into the back, and returned with a stack of folders. As he flipped through the documents, one thing became clear. Several bylaw amendments had been filed without public hearings or notarized votes. Some pages were missing witness initials. One revision, submitted under Byron's name, had been stamped 2 days after the deadline for legal amendment submissions. It was more than sloppy, it was unlawful. He returned home in silence. There were no angry thoughts in his mind, no quick plans for revenge, just clarity. Someone on the board had either gotten greedy, reckless, or both. But they made one mistake. They came after the wrong homeowner. By that evening, he had created a full timeline, attached documentation, and bookmarked everything that contradicted the original structure of Maplewood's charter. If they escalated, and he knew they would, he'd be ready. As he typed up his notes, he heard laughter from the street. He peeked through the curtains. Byron and 2 others were walking with coffee mugs, stopping at houses, speaking casually to neighbors. Soft smiles, friendly waves. A campaign in motion. Thomas leaned back and opened a drawer. Inside was an old digital recorder and a stack of unused notebooks. He hadn't needed to use them in years, but habits didn't fade easily. Whatever this was, a power play, a land grab, or something deeper, he would find the cracks in it. Slowly, patiently. They had forgotten who he was. The next HOA board meeting was posted with short notice. Just 3 days heads up, a clear violation of their own protocol. Still, Thomas circled the date and planned to attend. Not out of anger, not to confront. Observation was his first move. When the day arrived, the meeting was held in the community center's back hall, not the main room, where they used to welcome homeowners. The windows were blocked with temporary blinds, and a handwritten sign on the door read, "Board in session. Homeowners by invitation only." Thomas stood outside for a moment, then opened the door anyway. Inside, 5 board members sat in plastic chairs around a folding table, papers stacked unevenly between them. Byron Riggs glanced up and forced a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Thomas, didn't see your name on the attendance list," he said. His voice was smooth, too polished. "I didn't know the board had the authority to restrict homeowner access," Thomas replied, walking to an empty chair at the back. No one told him to leave. The meeting began. They read through motions quickly, brushing aside any objections as pre-approved. Thomas said nothing. He simply listened, watched. The way they interacted, noted who deferred to whom. It became obvious within 10 minutes. Byron ran the board like a private club, and the others followed out of convenience or silence. When the topic of compliance enforcement came up, Byron leaned forward. "We've had increasing complaints about homes falling short of community standards. It's time we protect our property values. We'll prioritize resolution letters followed by financial penalties. And in the rare case of prolonged resistance, we consider forced sale." That word, forced, floated like smoke across the room. A woman across the table hesitated. Her name tag read Andrea, secretary. She glanced toward Thomas, then looked away. Byron continued, unfazed. After the meeting, Thomas waited outside, near the hedges, where the air was still and the shadows long. He didn't want confrontation. He wanted one of them to speak first. It was Andrea. She stepped out alone, carrying a binder under her arm. When she noticed Thomas, she paused. "I'm not trying to interfere," he said calmly. "I'm just here to make sure we all remember what this community was built on." She hesitated, then stepped closer. "Not everyone agrees with Byron," she said quietly, "but people don't want to get involved. He's single quotes determined. He's rewriting the rules," Thomas replied. "And not legally." Andrew's eyes shifted. She hesitated, then said, "There was a document filed last year. He submitted it without signatures. I didn't realize it until after the deadline passed. I told him we had to redo it, but he said he'd handle it, that no one would notice." Thomas kept his voice steady. Would you be willing to say that again? She didn't answer, but she didn't walk away either. That night, back at home, Thomas opened a new folder. He labeled it Board Actions Unrecorded. Inside he placed typed notes from the meeting, including word-for-word quotes. He had recorded the audio discreetly with the device in his coat pocket, not for confrontation, but for clarity. He had no interest in drama. But if this board wanted to play dangerous games with authority, they'd need to remember who built the foundation they were now standing on. As the wind picked up outside, Thomas sat quietly under the study lamp. The light cast long shadows over his desk. This wasn't about fencing, or siding, or statues in the garden. It was about control, and control was something Thomas had never lost without choosing to. Rain tapped softly against the windows as Thomas sifted through neighborhood records late into the night. He had gathered scanned newsletters, old HOA voting tallies, even resident petitions from a decade ago. Piece by piece, he was forming a map not of property lines, but of shifting power. He wasn't just trying to prove the rule changes were invalid. He wanted to know why Byron had made them. A single name kept reappearing in unrelated places. Merrow Construction Services. On paper, it looked like a simple maintenance contractor. Landscaping, light repairs, snow removal in winter. But Thomas noticed a pattern. Invoices tripled over the past 2 years. Work orders were filed for homes that hadn't requested anything, and some charges listed street addresses that didn't exist. He took a short drive in the rain that morning, circling the outer edges of Maplewood. Several homes had perfectly manicured lawns, new paint, and brand new mailboxes, all consistent with Merrow's services. But there was one oddity. At the end of Willow Loop, where the neighborhood thinned into woodland, a single lot had been cleared. No house, just land, freshly flattened and roped off with bright orange tape. A sign had been knocked over by the wind. He stepped out and picked it up. Future Site Private Development. It was dated just 4 weeks earlier, and the signature at the bottom, Byron Riggs. Thomas placed the sign back down carefully. Later that evening, he returned home and checked the Maplewood Estates zoning map. That lot had never been intended for development. In fact, it was classified as community green space in the original documents, unless, of course, someone had changed those records. He made a few calls to contacts, still working in county zoning, quiet conversations, careful wording. One of them confirmed what he feared. The board had submitted a private request to reclassify the land for residential development. The request had been stamped and filed without a public vote. The attached justification claimed unanimous board approval. Thomas leaned back in his chair and exhaled. Byron wasn't trying to preserve Maplewood. He was carving pieces of it out for himself, and forcing out homeowners like Thomas, who lived near the edges of those planned zones. By morning, Thomas stood outside the community bulletin board with a manila envelope. Inside were printed side-by-side comparisons of zoning maps, fake Merrow invoices, and the development request document. He didn't sign his name. He didn't need to. He just pinned it where everyone could see. That same afternoon, a neighbor knocked on his door, Mrs. Patel. She lived 2 houses down and rarely spoke more than a hello. But now her eyes were wide, holding one of the printed pages in her hand. I thought it was strange, she whispered. They cut down 3 of our trees last month and said it was a mistake. But my husband saw surveyors near the fence the week before. Others began to show up that day. Quiet knocks, short conversations. Everyone had a story, an unexplained fee, a sudden warning, a notice that felt less like guidance and more like a threat. Byron had created an illusion of order, but the cracks were spreading. Thomas made a simple note in his notebook that evening. They're waking up, and when people wake up, they stop asking questions and start demanding answers. The silence that had kept Byron powerful was beginning to slip. Thomas was just getting started. The community center was unusually crowded that evening. What had once been a routine HOA meeting now felt like an unscripted town hall. Word had spread like wildfire. Neighbors whispered in clusters, eyes darting toward the back table where Byron Riggs and his small circle sat stiffly. Thomas arrived. Early, scanning the room. Familiar faces leaned in close, some hesitant, others fueled by quiet outrage. Mrs. Patel stood beside him, clutching a folder of printed documents, her voice low but firm. People are scared, she said, but they want to fight. They just don't know how. The meeting began with the usual formalities, but Byron's calm was forced. He read from a prepared statement, defending the recent changes as necessary to protect our property values and community standards. Thomas could see through it. The carefully chosen words felt like a thin veil over something much darker. When the floor opened for questions, a voice from the back rang out, a young father named David. What about the green space on Willow Loop? We saw trees cut down. Is that part of the plan too? Byron hesitated, then nodded slowly. Yes. The board approved a development proposal to increase housing density and expand the neighborhood. It's a decision made after careful consideration. A murmur rippled through the crowd. No mention of any vote. No mention of transparency. Thomas stepped forward, calm but commanding. Excuse me. That decision wasn't voted on by homeowners. It was submitted without proper approval. I have documents that show these changes were filed unlawfully. We need to address the facts, not just statements. A hush fell over the room. Face tightened. Those documents are disputed. This meeting is not the place for accusations. But the momentum had shifted. Andrea, the secretary, quietly handed Thomas a sealed envelope. He opened it to find meeting minutes, unsigned and incomplete, omitting key discussions about the zoning changes. It was proof, or at least a crack in the facade. Neighbors began sharing stories of sudden fees, inspections at odd hours, and warnings thinly veiled as threats. The weight of silence lifted, replaced by shared frustration. As the meeting ended, groups formed in the parking lot. Plans were whispered for petitions, for legal counsel, for gathering every scrap of evidence. Thomas felt a surge of hope. This was no longer a one-man fight. Yet as the crowd dispersed, he caught a glimpse of Byron standing alone, watching, calculating. The game was far from over. Back at his house, Thomas checked the front porch where a plain envelope had been slipped. Under the door, no return address. Inside was a single sheet of paper, typed, "Stop digging, or you'll regret it." Thomas folded the note carefully, then smiled faintly. They thought threats would scare him, but threats were a sign he was getting close. He locked the door and turned toward the study, ready to plan the next move. Days passed with a restless energy gripping Maplewood Estates. The neighbors who once avoided confrontation were now watching one another with cautious eyes. Conversations at mailboxes were quick but charged. Subtle glances replaced smiles. Trust was fraying like old rope. Thomas noticed the shift keenly. His own home, once a sanctuary, felt watched. One evening, as he walked the perimeter of his property, he spotted a van parked across the street. Its windows were tinted too dark, and the engine was off, but the driver's side door was slightly cracked open. The street lamp flickered, casting a wavering light over the license plate. Thomas kept his distance, taking note. The next day his mailbox was emptied. The usual bills gone, replaced by a small unmarked USB drive taped under the lid. Back inside, Thomas plugged it into his computer. The files were cryptic images of security cameras pointed directly at his home, photographs of his routine, and a map with certain houses circled in red. It was a surveillance log. Someone was watching, and not just him. He forwarded the files to Andrea with a brief note. "This is bigger than zoning." Her reply came quickly. "We need to meet tonight." That evening, Thomas found Andrea waiting at the edge of the park, shadows folding around her. "I'm glad you brought this," she said. "There are people on the board who don't know the full picture. Byron's not just changing rules, he's making deals with companies that benefit when we lose control." She handed him a folder thick with printed emails. Some were personal messages between Byron and executives at Marrow Construction Services. The tone was casual but urgent. Plans to expedite developments, to quietly force sales by increasing violations and fines. "We can't trust the entire board, but not everyone is involved. Some want to stop this." Thomas nodded slowly. "We need to build a coalition, neighbors, maybe even some inside the board." Andrea hesitated, then whispered, "There's one more thing. Last week, a retired judge living on Cedar Lane got a visit. They told him to reconsider his vote on a community issue. He refused. 2 days later, his house caught fire." Thomas's heart sank. This wasn't just intimidation. It was escalating. "We have to be careful," he said, "but we can't back down." Their meeting was interrupted by the sudden sound of footsteps behind them. Thomas spun around. A young man stepped out from the shadows. "I overheard," he said nervously. "My name's Marcus. I work for the county zoning department. I've seen irregularities for months, but was told to keep quiet. If you want to expose this, I can help." Thomas studied him, hesitant but earnest. "All right," he said. "We move forward, together." As Marcus joined their small group, Thomas felt a flicker of something he hadn't in weeks. Hope. But with every ally, the risk grew. Because Byron Riggs wasn't just rewriting rules anymore, he was rewriting the future of Maplewood Estates. And anyone in his way was disposable. The next morning, Thomas, Andrea, and Marcus gathered at Thomas's study. The room was cluttered with papers, printouts, and digital files, all slowly painting a damning picture of Byron Riggs's hidden agenda. Marcus pulled out a folder labeled Pending Approvals. He pointed to several documents that appeared ordinary at first glance: permit applications, routine inspections, but with one glaring issue: signatures forged or missing entirely. "These were correct," Marcus said. "I checked with the zoning office. Several applications bypassed review and were rubber-stamped within hours." Thomas felt the weight of the deception settling like cold stone in his chest. "This isn't just corruption," he said quietly. "It's a conspiracy." Andrea nodded. "And it's bigger than just development. Byron has allies on the board and in local government. They're all profiting." Thomas's mind raced. The quiet neighborhood he loved was becoming a battleground. The fight wasn't just about property lines or bylaws anymore. It was about exposing a network of power and greed. But that morning brought a chilling message. A knock at the door, sharp and insistent. Thomas opened it to find a plain envelope taped to the frame. No signature. No explanation. Inside was a single photograph. His study window at night, with a shadowy figure lurking outside, and beneath it, a typed line, "Last warning, stop, or lose everything." Thomas looked up, his calm veneer cracking for just a moment. Andrea saw the change and stepped forward. "We can't let fear control us," she said firmly. "If they think this will stop us, they're wrong." Marcus, meanwhile, had made quiet calls to a trusted contact at the county attorney's office. The official, a seasoned investigator, agreed to meet and review the evidence anonymously. It was a small victory, but a crucial one. That afternoon, as they prepared to leave for the meeting, Thomas paused by his front door. He noticed fresh tire tracks in the gravel, too wide for a standard car, like a heavy truck or SUV. He took a deep breath. The intimidation was escalating, the shadow was closing in. But Thomas's resolve hardened. "This ends one way," he told Andrea and Marcus. "We expose everything, and we take back our community." That evening, the trio met in a quiet cafe. They went over every piece of evidence again. The forged documents, the fake votes, the illegal filings. But Marcus brought something new, a list of homeowners quietly receiving unexplained violation notices. Many had been threatened with liens or forced fines. "We're not just fighting," Byron Marcus said. "We're fighting a system built to push people out." Andrea looked around. "Then it's time to organize. Get these homeowners involved. Make them see they're not alone." Thomas nodded. "We start with a letter. Clear, factual, outlining what's happening and what their rights are. We invite them to stand together." They worked late into the night, drafting the letter. Thomas's fingers paused over the keyboard, his mind circling the final line. "We are stronger together. We will not be silenced." Outside, the street was quiet. But the battle for Maplewood Estates was just beginning. And the man who wrote their rulebook was ready to rewrite the future on his terms. The morning the letters went out, Maplewood Estates stirred with a restless energy. Neighbors found envelopes slipped under doors, pinned 2 bulletin boards, and even taped 2 mailboxes. The message was clear. This was a call to unite, to resist the creeping takeover. Thomas and his small team began receiving calls and texts almost immediately. Some neighbors expressed fear, others hope. A few warned to be cautious, whispering about the board's power and influence. Still, turnout for the first informal meeting at the community park surprised everyone. Over 50 residents gathered, a mix of longtime homeowners, young families, and retirees, all tired of feeling powerless. Thomas stood at the makeshift podium, his voice steady but charged. "We are not just neighbors," he said. "We are a community, and communities protect what's theirs." The crowd's applause was tentative at first, then grew louder. But not everyone was watching from a distance. Byron Riggs had learned of the meeting and came flanked by 2 board members and a private security guard. His presence was like a storm cloud hanging over the gathering. Byron's eyes scanned the crowd. When he spoke, his tone was sharp. "This gathering is unauthorized and violates community rules," he declared. "I urge you to reconsider your actions before they lead to serious consequences." Whispers erupted, but Thomas held up a hand. "We're here because the rules have been broken, Byron, and we're here to demand accountability." Byron sneered but said no more. As he turned to leave, the security guard's eyes locked on Thomas. For a moment too long. That night, Thomas received a phone call from an unknown number. The voice was distorted but clear. "Back off, or we'll make sure you lose more than your house." Thomas's pulse quickened, but his voice didn't waver. "You're threatening a community. That won't work." Days passed with small but unnerving signs, tire tracks outside neighbors' homes, strange figures at dusk, anonymous flyers warning residents to stay silent. Yet the movement only grew. The neighbors formed committees, shared information, and began documenting every board action. Marcus continued to leak critical data from inside the zoning office, while Andrea coordinated legal advice. Then came the tipping point. One morning, Thomas found a letter taped to his front door, an eviction notice from a law firm representing Merrow Construction Services. The document claimed that his property was in violation of multiple community codes, some new, some fabricated, and that failure to comply would lead to forced sale. It was a bold escalation. At the next community meeting, Thomas confronted Byron directly. "This eviction is a sham. You know it, we all know it. This neighborhood won't be bullied." Byron's smile was cold. "We follow the law. You're the one resisting." Just then, Andrea stepped forward with a piece of paper, a certified letter from the county attorney's office. It declared an investigation into the board's actions, triggered by whistleblower reports and mounting evidence. The room fell silent. Byron's facade cracked. If only briefly. Thomas realized then that the fight had moved beyond words and warnings. It was now a battle for the soul of Maplewood Estates. And the man who thought he controlled the neighborhood was on the brink of losing everything. The news of the county attorney's investigation spread quickly through Maplewood Estates. The community buzzed with cautious optimism, but Thomas knew this was far from over. Byron Riggs was a man with everything to lose and no hesitation to fight dirty. The following week, the HOA board convened an emergency meeting. The room was tense, filled with wary board members and residents watching from the sidelines. Byron's usual confidence was diminished, his words clipped and defensive. But just as Byron attempted to assert control, the county attorney's representative stepped forward. She laid out the evidence, forged signatures, falsified documents, illegal zoning changes, and coordinated intimidation tactics. Byron's protests fell flat under the weight of proof. One by one, board members who had enabled his schemes distanced themselves, pledging cooperation with the investigation. Outside the meeting hall, Thomas stood among neighbors who had waited nervously. When the announcement came that Byron Riggs was being removed from the board and faced legal consequences, a wave of relief and quiet celebration swept through the crowd, yet the victory felt bittersweet. Thomas looked over the neighborhood, the cleared lot on Willow Loop, the scars left by battles fought in shadows and threats. Later that evening, Thomas received an unexpected visitor. It was one of Byron's former closest allies on the board, a woman named Clara. "I'm sorry it took so long to speak up," she said quietly, "but I couldn't live with what was happening. You reminded us what this community could be." Clara handed Thomas a sealed envelope, then turned to leave. Inside the envelope was a handwritten note from Byron himself. "You may have won this battle, but the real question is, who really wrote the rulebook? Look closely." Attached was a USB drive, with a mix of curiosity and caution. Thomas plugged it into his computer. The files revealed decades-old HOA documents, original bylaws, minutes, and amendments, all meticulously preserved but buried. Within were notes, signatures, and drafts, indicating that Byron had been involved in crafting many of the rules since the beginning. He had helped design the very system he tried to exploit. Thomas felt a chill. The man who tried to force him out had been shaping the community's foundations for years, maybe even decades. But there was more. Hidden in the files was a proposal Byron had drafted but never submitted, one that aimed to return more power to homeowners and increase transparency. It was a blueprint for reform, buried and forgotten. Thomas realized the truth was complicated. Byron wasn't just a villain. He was also a product of the system he created and then corrupted. The fight wasn't just against one man, but against the shadows of power that had lingered too long. As dawn broke over Maplewood Estates, Thomas stepped outside to see neighbors gathering for a new meeting, this time to rebuild and reclaim their community. He smiled, knowing the story wasn't ending, but beginning anew. And as for the rulebook, it was theirs too right now.